welcome everyone. Really appreciate you being here. And also welcome Charles, Stephen, and Martin. And Nicole, thank you also for being here. And we're really excited for this deep dive into the regen indicators and what Charles, Stephen, and Martin are learning on their farms, and Nicole kind of guiding them along that path. And just to say, I'm a co-founder of VitaCycle, and we make the Soilmentor app. And that we created the Regen Dashboard in partnership with Nicole Masters, who's here. And so you'll see that tonight we'll be using the Regen Dashboard and Soilmentor as a way to easily facilitate the interactions here between Nicole and the three different farmers. And I'm going to then now pass over to Martin, because Nature Friendly Farming Network are really hosting this evening for us all. And so Martin's going to say a little bit about that and a bit about the specific project that this is focused on. So go ahead, Martin.
Lovely, thank you much, and good evening, everybody. So my name's Martin, one of the farmers involved, but also the Chief Exec of the Nature Friendly Farming Network. The Nature Friendly Farming Network has been involved in a project the last year, working with the Nature Recovery Project to try and help farmers go on that, or start or record and go on that regenerative farming journey. So we've been working with a group of farmers, helping them with Soilmentor, doing some recording and bringing them together to sort of see best practice. So really tonight is about looking at some of that data, helping us understand how we can best use and get the best out of the data we're collecting and what the evidence that shows, and help us understand what our soils are up to and how we can improve that. So yeah, thank you very much, and I've got to hand over to Nicole, and really looking forward to tonight. So thank you very much.
Great. And I'll just say quickly, Nicole, I know you can introduce yourself, and I'm sure you will, but Nicole is, well, I'm sure many of you have heard of Nicole, but Nicole is I'll use my words, and then Nicole, you can change the words, but I would say a world-renowned agroecologist and coach, and has been really working in agroecology for quite a long time, probably similar to many of the farmers here, and, well over 20 years of experience. And many of you might have read her book, For the Love of Soil, which really brings together a lot of those learnings. And I think what's exciting about tonight is we'll see it's like almost like For the Love of Soil in action. Some of the discussions that are happening, it will be really, it's insightful to see that in action with farmers here in the UK. So I'll pass over to you, Nicole, and go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much for having me here, Abby. I've so enjoyed our friendship and exploring the Soilmentor for what it's done for us. Before COVID, we had a consulting company, and so we had our own app as such that was just really, really clunky and challenging to use in the field. So being able to make this process much more simplified in a way that it gives us immediate feedback. And I actually this morning was using it to collect some of the bird data, because birds have suddenly started turning up, Abby. It's so amazing when spring starts to break and the snow's melting and the birds are arriving. But yeah, as an agroecologist, this is very much a deep dive into what is your context. So that's certainly what we're going to explore with everybody today. And what are your challenges? And then how do we look for those points of leverage? How little does it take to actually shift the soil system and shift outcomes for producers, instead of, I think, where we've come from, which is more of that industrial approach in terms of how hard do I have to push, and putting more on and more on. And what I love about this approach is like, how little does it take, and what is your soil and your plant community trying to tell you? So this is going to be fun. I look forward to it, Abby.
Okay, great. So just so everyone's aware, the way it's going to work is we're going to start with Charles and dive into your farm and the few fields that you've been focused on and doing the regen indicators on. And then we'll move to Stephen and your farm, and then we'll go to Martin. And each of the farmers, you'll have about just under 20 minutes to go into things with Nicole. And then at the end, we'll leave 20 minutes for Q&A. So if people do have questions as we go, please do put them in the Q&A, and we will look to answer as many of those as possible towards the end. But yeah, so we'll get started. I'm going to share my screen, and then Charles and Nicole, I'll let you go and get stuck into your conversation. So here we go. I'm just going to mute myself.
Hi, Charles. Lovely to meet you.
Hi, nice to meet you.
So are you going to give us a little bit of background on what we are looking at here?
Yeah, so this is a bit of a potted history of the field monitoring that I've done so far. The fields that I'm focusing on tonight are Mill Hill, as a sort of that's indicative of a standard winter wheat cereal growing situation on our chalky boulder clay. It's maritime climate here. We've had about 800 and something odd, about 850 millimetres of rain this year, which is quite a bit more than normal. And then the next two fields, well, actually, it's all part of the same field, but they're divided into two blocks called Gun Club. One of them is the Gun Club bit itself is what we've just sown to spring barley. That was previously winter barley, followed by winter oilseed rape, followed by winter wheat, which was then had an overwinter cover crop, and then hopefully spring barley will come in it this year. And then next to it is a 3-year hay lay, which is in its third season now. And the comparison, I think, is most interesting in our management and the kind of crops we're growing between the Gun Club and the Gun Club hay lay. And if you look at the pictures in between the two fields, especially pictures of showing the soil spade, when I dug a spade worth, it's quite clear how much value grass adds to the structure. I would say this is one of our least easy to manage fields. The cereal side of it, the arable side of it, has been no-till now for the full period, but over 3 years. And what's happening is it's slowly getting more and more compacted. So these pictures here are all from the grass lay, and it's not absolutely ideal, but I think you'll find my opinion is that it looks to be much more friable, a lot more crumbly. It's smaller soil aggregates, a lot more crumbly. There's worms all up in the top, as you expect. It's a bit difficult on heavy land to find good quality pictures of riser sheaths, because when you pull the aggregates apart, they tend to strip the roots, pull the roots about. But there are riser sheaths there on a lot of the roots, and although it's not so easy to photograph. Quite a nice lot of worms. As you can see there, I've just shaken the clods off that. So that's typical of grassland, I would say. So I invite comments from you about that, and then we'll hop back and look at the horror story, which is the spring, the Gun Club bit, the arable bit.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Sometimes I think to get the riser sheath when we have a heavier clay soil it might be worth just rinsing it underwater. Having a bucket of water just to loosen it up. It does look like there's still quite a bit of mealybug. Can you go back to 2 photos earlier, Abby? Did you see that? There, go. Yeah, that. Yeah, see that. Right there.
There's you call that mealybug, do you?
Yep.
Okay, right, fair enough.
Yeah, so just distinguishing that from, say, like a fungal presence, but it still points to what your other fields were saying in terms of there is insect pressure in here. And what I can see is that you're starting that soil building process. So you see the very fine aggregates in the top of that picture, and I think the one before, you can see the system is starting. And I think that is the benefit of putting into a grass layer or a pasture, just to interrupt perhaps a cycle.
I agree.
Yeah.
I I personally think that our land needs to see a lot more perennial type cropping grass because it's growing all the time, you know, apart from obviously the really cold weather in the winter, but it's green all year round, the ground's covered all year round, and particularly with a hay lay, is it's allowed to grow up tall and then cut down and then grow again, which obviously aids the rooting. For us, I think the weakness in our systems with our conventional arable cropping is the fact that we're having to shift away from autumn cropping when we can do field preparation, sowing, etc., when the soil is dry, to spring operations, because we're trying to avoid a particular weed, blackgrass, which is a problem in winter crops. So by waiting till the spring, we can spray off with glyphosate and lower the pressure. But we're quite often having to work the ground or travel on the ground when the soil is damper, and that is putting compaction in. So if you go back to, if you can go to the other field.
I wouldn't mind before you do, Charles, if it's all right, because
yeah.
I've been thinking this, and someone actually just asked it as well, is so the infiltration in this field is still really slow, even though you can see the beginnings of aggregation. When did you take that? Was the soil already quite wet when you did your infiltration?
So we've just been drying out after a prolonged period of wet, and we've been waiting forever to get on and do something on the fields. So up until probably 10 days or a fortnight ago, there was still water lying around in places up there. It's, in our area, clay land, the tops of the gently rolling topography are flat and they don't drain. They take longer to. There we are. There's a picture from about a month ago. That's not the actual site. That's sort of on the edge, near the edge of the field. But considering all we do is go and make hay during July, it's not poaching or machinery. It's really to do with being flat and being clay, and the underground drainage not moving the water away quickly enough. That's not ready to go on when I can get it on.
Yeah. I'd also argue, just purely from what microbiology do when we really get this system going, is that there's not a lot of air spaces in there. There's not a lot of gas diffusion or movement. And I mean, these clays potentially, do they swell? Do you see that?
Yeah, they swell and crack. It's a chalky clay, so it's naturally structuring. But my father tells me, he's 91, that some of the fields on the top, the land was all left idle in between the walls for a number of years. And these fields grew rushes in their natural state. So we've always known that underground drainage is important on our land. And I think that remains even more so the less tillage we do, especially with the disruptive weather patterns, the more we're finding that we're having to sort out underground drainage, and mold draining into the porous backfill, which covers the underground drainage, is something we're finding we have to do. And that field hasn't been done for quite some time. I think you get away with it with grass, it sorts itself out, and by the time it comes to grow hay, it's not a serious impediment to the grass growth. That's the back end, so that's after the aftermath. And we actually managed to get a subsidy for leaving it headed for seeded heads for wild birds. So you don't touch it or graze it over winter, and just leave the headed grass there for birds to feed on. So the first picture observation on the left, because that's the one, can you open that one? So that's the best I could do, digging down to 30 centimetres. So this hasn't been had any cultivation other than just drilling. And it's just slowly got more and more solid. and we put a spring crop in there, but I'm not at all happy with the structure. And we're basically, I think, going up a cul-de-sac there, not just soil health, which is obvious, but I think also for sustainability and resilience with disruptive weather. I think this is where we really are with our farming practices in this country now. Tillage, inappropriate tillage. We get away with it by chucking fertilizer on and dragging iron through it, but I think ultimately we're going to have to find a way to integrate more perennial crops and different things. Obviously, it's not easy to just start up a livestock enterprise, so we may be looking to get people in to do that, but the margins on a lot of livestock aren't particularly good. So one of the interesting things is the new SFI agreements, which offer quite attractive payments to basically put this sort of land into a 3-year grass type of sward or a legume fallow with the obvious benefits that we would get from it.
Can you, Abby, if you don't mind just leaving that up, because I think, you know, there's many roads to Rome, but what builds structure is that capture of sunlight energy. That plant is then sending sugar out its roots, sending different types of foods to feed microbiology that then enable these systems, enable structure to be built. So we don't build structure because we bring cows in. We don't build structure because we bring in perennial grasses. What's happening is that, one, some of these grasses might be in a healthy state. You might not be using things like ammonium nitrate or triple super, which we know, I mean, the triple super immediately shuts down our fungal networks around those plant roots and what's building structure. So one of the ways that we see large-scale cropping operators or arable overcome this is actually by putting some kind of, you know, biological stimulants or compost or whatever on the seed in a process that we call biopriming to start to build aggregation. So aggregation is not something we buy, it's something that we support an ecosystem in. And like the data that you had was saying, you know, your root systems are only like 10 millimeters, I think. You know,
10
it's really
centimeters.
nothing.
10
Yeah.
centimeters, yeah.
10 centimeters. Oh, that's not too bad enough.
I
mean,
this all had, you wouldn't believe it now, but this was a winter wheat crop last year, and we auto cast a cover crop on and it also had biodigestate on it last autumn, and it grew over winter. It had a successful cover crop on it. There's might be some pictures somewhere back in the day. So, and it's had plenty of radishes and things growing. There was plenty of, there you go, there's the cover crop. You know, that was last autumn, that same field, not far away from where the previous photos are. I think the problem is we've had a very wet winter. That's when it got frosted. But I think it's when we get to the spring, there's when this all dies back. If we then try and do something with it and put a crop in, we're immediately going backwards. When we're using this kind of kit to do it with, you know, it puts it in, but it's heavy, and that's 9 meters. So we're minimizing the wheelings, but nevertheless, it's still a backward step, especially on a very wet year like we've been in, you know.
You've been using some biosolids, is that right?
Yeah, so we use, not all the time, but we use sewage sludge for the phosphate, human sewage sludge for phosphate, and we use biodigestate, which is from, I think, sandwich waste, food waste, which is high nitrogen, got quite a lot of K in it as well, not so much P in it. We use that as a fertilizer. About half of it is, it depends on the years. They're a bit intermittent with how they can supply it. Some years we use mostly that on our spring cropping, rely on that. Other years we'll have to use nitrogen prill. So we do try and mix it up a bit, as you know, according to availability.
Yes. I have some concerns about what's in human sewage, and I don't know how much you looked in.
Well, yeah, I agree. I agree. Yeah. By
We
far,
can't,
by far and away the cheapest form of phosphate, given that we're not at the stage yet where we could harness our own, I don't believe, because we're mostly bacterial dominated soils. So we're a way off getting the fungal network that would deliver what we need, is my belief anyway.
Yeah. So I just start thinking every time you're out, anytime you're doing a pass, think, how do I feed my fungi while I'm doing this? So that might be your fertilizer, your herbicide applications, if you are using any pesticides. Oh, we didn't look at your insects. I think you've said you've got some insects in there. And then really think every time you're out, how do I feed my underground livestock and start to get that aggregate building? Because that's why water's not moving, right? That's why these soils are more challenging to work with. It's not just the soil type, and that's certainly a bigger factor than someone who was on sand, obviously, but we can still build aggregate stability and structure. And I think doing that slaking test would be really cool. And you've done it in other places, right?
Yeah.
I see in our fields. Yeah. And do you find that those particles just kind of collapse?
I find that it depends really. If you take the samples on the banks where the land's more eroded and the organic matter levels are sort of closer to 4, then yeah, it doesn't perform very well. As you move down to the valley bottoms, which is where all the decent soil has ended up, it's quite different, and the farming outcomes are quite different. So it's quite understandable, really.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's beautiful. I'm really impressed with the information you're collecting. And has this been a valuable exercise for you, like being able to see this and then being able to
Absolutely.
compare?
So if I'm absolutely honest, I've been farming since the 70s, and this is the first time I've really got down on my hands and knees in the last few years and actually started looking at the biology. And when I went through college, soil science was a science about chemistry and physics. We then went to farm machinery courses, which told us what kit to use. And then we did crop husbandry, which told us what crops to grow and what chemicals to put on, and that was it. And that's how we looked at it. And I've looked at soil from the surface and from what the machinery does to it. We've made it perform we've bashed it so that we can grow cereals in it, and we've not understood what we were doing to the biology. So this going through best tests and all the rest of it, so it really makes you stop, dig a hole, get down there, and when you've got to record stuff, you've really got to look at it. And it's totally changed my outlook. I know that in order to be resilient and to cope with the disruptive weather patterns, we need to make changes. We can't carry on as we are. I don't believe it's viable for all sorts of reasons. Everything is focusing now on the soil. Everything that's coming towards us, it's all about the soil.
Yeah, it's a global phenomenon. Well, thank you so much, Charles. I really appreciate hearing a bit.
Okay, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen a second. Thanks, Charles. And Stephen, if you're happy to unmute yourself and maybe just start sharing a little bit of your context while I switch over my screen to your account.
Okay, so well, I feel a bit of a fraud actually, because unlike Charles, who's been farming for years, and Martin, I'm not really a proper farmer. So my brother and I inherited the family farm, which has been in the family for over 100 years. But when my uncle retired in the year 2000, it was then let out to a neighbour on a farm-based tenancy, and it has continued since. But then I've just we've planned to sort of move to the farm. I've taken down the old farmhouse that my great-grandparents built because it was no longer fit for purpose, and we've actually built a new modern timber-framed house, which we actually moved into on Saturday. So it's just been a very busy time at the moment. But what I've done is that I was approached by, we're in a hotspot for great crested newts, and I was approached by a body called the Newt Conservation Partnership, who were interested in doing an environmental project on the farm. And our tenant wasn't interested, but I said, well, I am. So I ended up taking back in hand 3.5 hectares, which is about 9 acres of what was previously arable land, but with the intention of we revert that to grassland, restore 2 old ponds and dig 2 new ponds, which we were sited. There's part of the field which always lay wet. My uncle, every year he was having to sort of mold drain that side of the field. So we thought, well, that's a good place to dig ponds. And sure enough, they are to the brim full of water. But when I was talking to them, because what I wanted to do was create sort of species-rich grassland, and probably just farm on a small scale with some animals. So I was talking to them, the newt people. Obviously, they're very knowledgeable about newts. But then when they were talking about some of the other sort of environmental things, there was a few alarm bells, because they were saying, well, the first thing we need to do is impoverish the soil, and particularly get the nitrogen levels down. And I've got readings here. I don't know. They said they're high. I don't know what is high or what's low, but they're very much. So the prescription was to seed it with ryegrass, which we've done. And then there's also natural regeneration happening as well. And then I need to sort of cut that at least once, if not twice a year, and bale it, and for it to be carted off. But I was also, when I was talking to one of the project officers initially, she said, well, of course, we could just scrape off the topsoil for you and just take it away. And I was thinking, what? And because they dug some test pits and to see if they held water, which they did. And I know that the topsoil, we're looking at least 12 to 15 inches of topsoil before we hit the clay underneath. I mean, it's a hand slope series boulder clay, very similar to actually what the soil type that Charles was demonstrating and showing. We're on very similar land, but I was thinking, well, I can't believe environmentalists are saying that. That soil that represents thousands of years of history to be built up, and to say, well, just take it away and impoverish. So I thought, well, I need to inform myself or be better informed. So I started doing some research, which is then when I hit upon the nature-friendly farming network. And I must say, I've found that really, really helpful. I've been to a couple of seminars at Martin's farm, which have been really helpful and just opened my eyes. And I've learned so much from pretty much a nil base, really, a zero base. So I found that very helpful. But I'm now sort of thinking, although I was sort of thinking, well, it'd be nice to have a species-rich grassland. And I always remember stories that my mum told me growing up on the farm as a girl, and that field particularly, it was ridge and furrow before the war, and orchids used to grow in profusion, apparently. We don't have any orchids now, and I don't suppose they would probably come back now, but it would be nice to sort of have other sort of a wider diversity than just ryegrass.
Yeah, and I
And
think, oh, sorry.
yeah,
Continue.
so I'm really just looking for advice, because I've now, looking into it, I'm thinking, well, rather than an impoverished soil, I should actually be looking for sort of a rich soil or a diverse soil, and just as much as a species rich cover is important, it's actually what's happening below the surface that's equally important. And so I've started, and I was thinking, well, actually building up a record over time. The Soilmentor app is going to be invaluable in helping to do that. So I've started. You've seen, I've done a few tests. I haven't had a lot of time with one thing or another, but I have done a few, and I guess I'm sort of realizing, well, a lot of the field lay quite, it was squelchy underneath during the winter, sort of very similar to sort of pictures of that Charles was showing. But what I was surprised is that, I did the filtration tests, and most of them were pretty much what I was expecting. The water just sort of sat there, and after 20 minutes, I just gave up and just recorded it as 20. But there was one corner of the field which I actually did this morning, and I turned my back and it was like, oh, the water's disappeared. So I thought, well, what happened there? And I put it in, and it only took a minute, which just shows it's the same field, and yet, elsewhere, it's just not going down at all. And yet there's obviously areas where it does just drain. I don't know whether it's to do with the field drains or what, but it was just interesting because, I would have, if someone had asked me, I would have just assumed that, taking a test in one area, it would just be homogeneous across the rest of the field. So that was an important lesson for me. But yeah, you sort of see there, typical the ryegrass, the roots, a lot of white roots. So I don't think, and it's all quite matted at the top. You can sort of see how wet the soil actually is there. So I was just sort of looking, and the worm counts are not probably not that high. I think they sort of vary from 4 to, is it 15? Or 1 was the yes. So there's one variable.
So you entered low rainfall in the benchmarking. Was that a mistake?
Well, that's sort of, I would always historically say that we're in a low rainfall area, but of course this year has been the exception. As I was interested, Charles, just to see, 850 millimeters. If you had that, then we equally had that. And at that time we were doing groundworks around the house, sort of putting in service trenches and it was just churning up liquid mud on top of liquid mud. It's been absolutely horrible. But one of the benefits is that actually I've used part of that field. We did excavate down a meter deep by 50 meters and long and 13 meters wide to put in the ground source heating. So I've had one benefit out of taking that field back in hand already, because the house is very cozy and warm. So that's one blessing. But it's just really, as I say, I'm new to this, and so just would like a sort of advice in where do I go from here, and how do I have like intelligent conversations with the newt, because I feel I need to sort of drive. I mean, they're sort of experts on newts, but when it comes to the field itself and the habitat and everything else, I need to be sort of driving those conversations and the plan forward. So I don't know, just from your observations from the data, limited data, obviously, that's
I'm
there.
just going to interrupt you, Stephen, only because we've only got like 20 minutes and now we've got 8. And so I want to make sure you get the best value out of this for yourself. There's some really good work that was done in Ireland looking at the movement of nitrogen and nitrates through the profile, depending on the species mix that you have in your fields. And, and I think it goes back to Charles of what you were looking at as well, is that when we have these soils that are very tight, when we have soils that are very waterlogged, when we have very shallow rooting systems, you're now in a situation that's losing a lot of nitrogen, right? And it'll either be volatilized up or it's being lost into waterways. And so you can end up on this vicious cycle, particularly in cropping, is you're now going to need 10 times the amount of nitrogen when that soil loses structure, and you're going to lose 10 times the amount of nitrogen to the waterways. So really thinking, what are some of the deep tap-rooted species perhaps that you could put into a mix? I'm a big fan of chicory, but there's many other species. Thinking of some of our nitrogen scavengers, so using, maybe putting in a diverse multi-species mix that maybe has got some brassicas in it, or might have some, I don't know if you can grow corn or sorghum, Sudan. You definitely can grow things like squash. Squashes are really good nitrogen sucker outerer, but thinking the minute that nitrogen moves past your rooting zone, now it's just going to move straight into the waterways. So how do we make sure we've got as diverse and as deep a rooting system as possible? And that really, again, comes down to building aggregation in this system. And yeah, by saying low rainfall, then that actually changes our measures. So actually a lot of these measures are in the red. So this is a great time to start benchmarking and taking a look at this stuff, Stephen, because in my mind, the only place is up from here, as long as the newt guys don't take your soil off you. And I think it's such a shame that
I wasn't going to let them
everybody's
do
in
that.
these. I'm going to use this story, Stephen, because I am absolutely appalled. And by doing that, they're going to end up with a whole lot more sediment in their waterways. Like, they're actually going to work against the newt by destroying the ecosystem. Like, it makes no sense to me. Anywho,
No, it didn't make sense. And I, from my limited, so I thought that can't be right. So I need to.
no. So I'd take a look at what is happening with nodules. Were you seeing any legumes in these fields? Any clovers?
No, there's no clover. There was last summer, there was a lovely crop of wheat, which had, completely, I was thinking it was almost as good as if it had been drilled. And so the wild birds had an absolute feast over winter. Because although we cut it for hay, someone cut it for haylage actually at the end of May. It actually came back up and headed quite well.
Wow. And I think the other thing, Stephen, it really, what I see, and it's quite interesting, I'm working with quite a few Englishmen right now, and there's that propensity to feel like we need to compare ourselves. Maybe you don't feel like you've been farming as long as other people, and it's okay. It's when we compare ourselves that's when we lose creativity, and it's where we lose our innovation. So I think just seize the bull by its horns and do the most extraordinary job that you can do without feeling like that you haven't earned the right to be a farmer. You are a farmer. Embrace it. Yeah. Anything else? The earthworms that you were seeing, did you see did some of the earthworms look different, or they all kind of look the same? Have you got any photos of them?
There's some photos they're in the blue bucket or blue box. It's like a margarine tub.
That's another benefit of lovely, is that what you can see there is you've definitely got, I think, 3 different species in there, right? So you've got that larger dark-headed, saddle's quite far back. I'm not sure what the species is. But those worms will be moving up and down through the profile. So we want to see more and more of those, especially when we're thinking about water moving down through the profile, is where have we got those gorgeous deep movers. And then the little pink one, I think that's a rose worm, they move sideways, right? They move sideways through the profile. They're all helping to build aggregations. Now, your worm numbers are low, but at least there's some diversity and there's some differences in ages in here too. So you've got a little baby worm on the bottom left. And you can tell because their saddle's not very developed. You see that big swollen bit on the fat worm, right? Yeah. So that means that, you know, they're able to make their own babies. But looking at this through the season is where do we see this changing? Do you see the diversity changing and the age contrast changing? That could all be really important. So this is beautiful, taking a photograph. Stephen, is that you can actually track this for yourself moving forward and go, okay, this was our benchmark. This is where we were starting, and let's get these worms very excited. And again, that's where some of these deep tap-rooted species, I don't know if you guys have ever dug a hole around like a thistle plant, and what you'll find is worms love thistles, right? There's a whole lot of really cool stuff biologically happening around those thistle roots. There's also calcium and trace elements being emitted out the roots of those thistles, and the worms just love it. So, well, actually, they're
You're
feeding
telling
the
me to
biology.
plant thistles.
Yes, yay! Yeah, no,
You
I'm
won't-
not. I'm
you
saying,
won't to plant thistles.
but that it's part of what the thistle's doing to remediate, and that's where I like chicory, right? So chicory can be put in if you are seeing thistles. Go, okay, what's doing something similar to a thistle, but that might be quite beneficial, right? And beneficial for birds and bees.
So is it chicory as a thistle replacement
Yes.
or a
Yes,
substitute?
indeed. Yeah, a
I
substitute,
know
but
it's a
also just
substitute for
thinking.
coffee. I didn't know it was a substitute for thistles.
Yes, indeed. Indeed. Very good. Yeah, and then insect, you didn't count any insects, but what kind of insects were you seeing underneath the ground?
Well, I did. Oh, there was that beetle and there was a slug, but there didn't seem to be very few insects at all.
Oh, no, which is an observation in itself too, right? Just not a lot of activity in life. Very, very good. And sometimes, you know, if you've got some bigger tap-rooted plant species, you can just zoom in and see, is there anything chewing on some of those plants? You know, oh yeah, that. What was that? Is it oh, what is that? Any guesses, anyone? I can't see them. You got the leaves.
Upside.
So yeah, sometimes what you'll find is you'll see actual grooves from some of our root chewers, and you might even see nematode damage. And again, this is a biological test you could send away, but and that's interesting where the roots broke off too. You know, it's like when sometimes when you pull plants out, they'll break off at where that hardpan layer is. So sometimes you could identify a hardpan just by where do those roots stop.
Yeah, I think the soil's quite compacted.
Yes. Yeah, it looked very tight. It does, you know, and I think that's part of what's driving this lack of water movement. But no, that's fantastic. All right. Well, thank you so much, Stephen, for sharing your journey
So deep-rooted plants is the number one tip.
Deep-rooted species, diversity, getting a diverse mix in there, and then addressing that compaction. There's been quite a few questions about compaction. You know, plants can access that. That Irish study, I will, what I'll do is I'll send the link to Abby, and Abby, you could find out that. No worries. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Nicole. That's been really helpful. Thank you.
Great. So thank you, Stephen. And Martin, thanks for popping up at the right time. And if you could, I just got to get your account up, but if you could maybe just share some of your context and the fields that you want to be looking at with Nicole.
Thank you very much. And I also got my son, Matt, who's sitting beside me to the side, so he may chip in with some answers as well. So for some context, we've got two fields we'll be talking about, but our farming system, we've been looking with for the last 20 plus years around habitat around the outside of fields and the focusing around what does biodiversity deliver for our business and for our farm. And probably 10 years ago, started to recognise the damage we were causing to our soil structure, seeing tractor footprints in the bottom of plough pans or plough furrows from one year to the next. And then we went on a bit of a journey of reducing cultivations, and then also recognising that we had a big problem with blackgrass. We're creating stale seed beds, then we're putting a cultivator drill through there and disturbing the soil again, so more blackgrass was germinating in our following crops, which went down on a journey of a drill with low disturbance. My theory being that we can germinate the rubbish, the weeds, low disturbance drill, we'll have less weeds coming up in our following crop, which then went on a journey of, if we're doing that, we can add cover crops into the system, because we'll be able to drill straight into them, and trying to understand the role of the roots and the structure of the worms and the roots and the different cover crops mixes we can do to improve that soil structure. And then really trying to focus that the only bit of metal should enter a field, certainly post-harvest, is a spade, and trying to identify what was going on. And then we come on to starting getting involved with Soilmentor and collecting the data through some of the projects we're involved with. And it gave us a clear benchmark, and sort of having a standardized process of recording, getting down and looking in the ground and digging a hole is, I think, is really important, and it really helps you to understand the structure that's going on, the healthiness of the soil, the smell of the soil. And then we're focusing mainly tonight on 2 fields, which is a 72 acre, which is an arable field, which was spring beans, then it's in its second winter wheat. We cover crop over winter, that's had grazing in, and it's also had manures, either chicken manure or horse manure, applied through its rotation. And another field is what we call wood field, which is currently in the herbal lay, and it's in its 3rd year. We identified that field had a weed burden and had a really poor soil structure in places. So we've taken it out of production and put it in herbal lay, and then it return in production next year. And we're adding more herbal lays and legume fallows into our system to sort of really get that soil health building up and dealing with the structure. And then sheep are visited by a neighbouring farmer, young farmer hasn't got a farm himself, but it's got a lot of sheep. And then we're looking at, can we bring cattle in and other animals to see what happens, in managing this forage that we produce.
Can you just go up a little bit, Abby, if that's all right? Thanks, Martin. So on this, the 3 pastures that we're looking at, are they at the top?
No, it's 72 and Woodfield that's further down.
Oh yeah, I just saw it. So infiltration looks like it's a bit of a challenge in many places. Then you've got some infiltration that's amazing. So when you're looking at some of those fields that are really quick, is that something you've been doing management wise? Are you doing an infiltration test after you've just come in and drilled? What's going on?
So some of that's the area of the fields. There is variation. We've had the samples that have collected lately were after a lot of rain. Previous times it wasn't. So we are really, through this testing, really trying to identify, or being able to see the variation within a field. We have some places it drains really easy, and other places it's not. So now we're trying to think within a field, how can we change the management or do things to improve those weaker areas? And some of that's the improving drainage underneath and other things to help that move water. We're on heavy clay soil and it undulates across the field. So you end up on a really heavy wet year, some pooling, because it needs to get the water away.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really interesting to me. I was talking to a bunch of farmers that just put in a whole lot of tile drainage at the bottom of New Zealand, and then the following season they hit a dry year and it was catastrophic. So it's often how do we come about some of these things with that long-term view? And I like the level of sampling and across your property you're doing here is phenomenal. So being able to measure, yes, after you've had heavy rainfall, and then what's that infiltration like when we don't? Now, we've measured soils, and admittedly these are loams, but some of these soils are absorbing like 18 inches in an hour. What does it take? What differences can we start to make on these soils so that we can really hold more and more water And a big part of that is your organic matter. Do you know what your organic matters are on these top
It
soils?
twos and threes, but it does vary across the field. We've mapped the whole field for organic content in various places across the field.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, Charles, you had pretty high soil carbon or soil organic matter. So, you know, that's going to make a difference in terms of how well does the soil operate like a sponge. And, you know, in a loam soil, you could say that a 1% increase in organic matter can hold on to an additional 144,000 litres at one time in the growing season, and that's on a per hectare basis. So what does it look like to be able to build more functional carbon in this environment? And then ask the question of what's happened to that soil carbon, because you potentially would have had much higher in these soils, I'm guessing, without being on the property with you. But yeah, what's happened to it, and then how do we bring it back? So are you doing things to actively feed microbiology or thinking about that?
In what how do you mean?
So you're doing multi-species mixes. Are you putting anything down with the seed? Are you doing anything
no,
when you
cover crops, bring in manures, bring in livestock? We haven't gone down of adding anything to the seed, or as we're drilling. We've tried some biostimulant seed treatments in the past and other magical things that can do things, but we've gone away from that. We're trying to focus on really getting a healthy soil. What can we do to add to the mix to really get the roots going?
Yes. Yeah, really great. So sometimes what I'm going to look at, if I've got a tighter soil and roots really are not moving through, or water's not really moving through, then I'm going to ask the question of which of the 5 M's is putting a drag on the system. Is it on my low organic matter? Is it a mineral imbalance? Is it a microbial imbalance? And so what we find is when soils become much more bacterially dominated, which I believe, Charles, you were looking at, then what happens is our soil structure starts to collapse, right? So it could be a microbial driver, but 2, it could also be a mineral driver. Do we see things potentially like high potassium, high magnesium? They can create these very tight, harder to move through soils. Are you on a higher calcium soil though? Like a lot of...
Not particularly high. No.
Particularly, right. So then that could be some of the driver about what is creating this issue. Because yeah, your rooting depths, 80%. Is that centimeters or that's centimeters, right? 9 centimeters?
Yeah, it depends on centimeters, and it depends on that one depends on the time of year. So some is, not long after being established.
So based on these observations, what's your next step?
Trying to get more cover crops and catch crops established well, and get some really good root structure going in that. Carry on using the sheep as graziers wherever possible. Looking to how can we increase more organic matter through composts and manures. We use a little bit of chicken manure, but we have to use it carefully because it's very rich. I'm trying to make more of a horse manures and composts and mix that up to get some biology going in that.
Nice. And you did the insect score in some fields. What kind of insects are you seeing?
What are we seeing, Matt? So beetles, some earwigs, some spiders, but nothing really in the soil. Lots of worms, but not a lot of other nothing I'm worried about. We'd see the odd slug, but there's plenty of beetles about. We hardly use slug pellets because we have a good balance of predatory species to eat the pests.
Beautiful. Yeah. Predatory species, and also what we find is protozoa eat slug eggs. So what we can sometimes find is people start to move to even like an organic no-till where they're putting a lot of organic material down, and their slug numbers can go through the roof. And when we look at their testing, what we find is they're very, very low in protozoa. So this could point to actually having good protozoa numbers if you don't see a lot of slug pressures when you've got more material around. And some of your fields like that, the second one from the top, you've got 42% bare earth. Is that just because of spacing? of your crop
It was
spacing?
cultivated after some manure was put on last autumn. So
Yeah.
it's got a friable, more open structure on the top. We'd incorporated a bit of the straws.
Mhm. Nice. Right. So when we look at bare ground, some of that's probably mulch as well, like straw.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
because we put manures on, we have to keep comply with legislation, do a shallow cultivation. And it also means we're not losing it oxidization.
Yeah. Yeah, really good. Stephen, this is another thing for you to look at is the use of some of these like barley straws or what kind of straw is that?
That wouldn't be a wheat straw, I should think,
Like a
looking at
wheat
which
straw.
fields it's in.
But
Yeah,
that,
and we're
yeah.
also focusing on when we're applying fungicides to the wheat crop, because what we've found is if we're putting a late ear wash on and putting heavy fungicide treatment, the straw doesn't break down as well. So we're trying to really minimise the foliar application of fungicides to allow that straw to really be incorporated and work well. But it's that fair balance of not getting disease and then finding crops that have less disease. And it's that journey of finding the right varieties.
Yes. Yeah. And I think, I mean, it really points to the soil health journey as well as what we find early in the system as we're starting to move to lower inputs is what is that fungal pressure and where's your threshold and yeah, because we know that when you put a fungicide on, you know, we're taking a step back for our soil health program, but you're also taking a step back in terms of overall nutrition of the crop that you're growing. Like some of these fungicides they've shown can alter 600 different genes in the plant, and those genes are responsible for things like nutrient density or signaling to microbiology or plant defense. So it's one of the ones that we like to see how do we figure out why you have fungal diseases? There's a really great book by Don Huber called Mineral Nutrition and Fungal Diseases, I think. Mineral Nutrition. Oh, well, I'll send it to Abby, but it's a really good one to just take a look at. Well, what kind of disease pressure am I looking at? And then what relationship does that have to microbiology and to minerals? And starting to think of, you know, fungal diseases as being more of an indicator of overall health. You know, and the more that you start to build soil structure, I think you'll see those things start to shift.
We've been doing more tissue sampling and sap analysis, sap testing.
Yeah.
And what we've been finding with the tissue analysis, that we've been short on trace elements when the crop looks distressed, not nitrogen, and giving it a seed weed treatment or something else brings the life back in. And where the
Beautiful.
crops were stressed, that's where the disease and other issues come in. And it's trying to join up the whole system and cycle and trying to react or learn what we got to test for to get the evidence to give us the confidence to go forward.
Beautiful. Lovely. Yeah. And so what we're doing a lot with our arable is we're putting trace elements down with the seed, and we're talking about grams per acre of some things like molybdenum or manganese, and really seeing that plant response because those trace elements are so important for different aspects of plant health and nutrition and disease resistance. So great. There's such great observations. I'm really impressed.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see the amount of worms in the different fields. What I'm disappointed about is where we've got the herbal lays in the wood field, that's becoming a tighter structure, and it looks like there's less deep burrowing worms in there and more of the little ones that are on the surface. And I'm hoping when that comes back into the rotation, that'll go into winter beans as soon as it comes out of the herbal lay for a season, then into cereals. But we can soon get that worm life back balance. There's some pictures and you can see sort of how tight some of the ground looks compared with others. So that you can see that one, it's quite a tighter soil profile, quite stiff and wet. And that's in a 3-year herbal lay. And it's when you compare that where we are with the arable, that's more friable and structured. So it's quite interesting for me to see it's not doing as much as I hoped, as quick as I'd hoped. But what will happen when it comes back into the rotation?
Well, it might be a question of what species did you put in there, and I think the other thing is when you dig a hole like that, this is perfect, is for people, everyone else, observe when you do that because you can see where that potentially that's an old plow pan, right? That there's that level of restriction, and this is part of why we put a little bit of molybdenum on seed as well, as molybdenum helps the plants to overcome any ethylene production that's happening down there, because ethylene will actually shear roots off. And that happens when we get these compaction layers, and that molybdenum can actually overcome that ethylene production. So it's something else. Even if I was putting in a herbal lay, I was still putting a little bit of trace element on it potentially for the next crop. But yeah, there's certainly interesting things happening in that.
And the herbal
Yeah.
lays were only grazing it like 1 or 2 times a year, really letting it grow top biomass and then mob graze it, and really sort of tightly push it down and trying to get that balance of rapid growth, root growth, but then leave lots of material on the surface to sort of feed the biology and the worms.
Yeah, and I guess balancing that with not doing a lot of soil damage when you're grazing it more heavily, and then I think when you do see a bit of damage and you've been grazing in the wet, it's just leaving some of these places a little longer. But yeah, I can't see, it looks very grass dominant. Are there other things in there?
Yeah, it's got a lot of clovers and chicory and all sorts in, but the grass is getting, as you see, again dominant. That was grazed a couple of months ago. It had a full growth over late summer and autumn, and then we throw the sheep on there.
Excellent. All right. Well, I think, are we on time, Abby? I'll hand the time to you. There's been quite a lot of amazing questions in the chat box. I know. You tell me what you want to do.
Yeah, no, I don't know, Martin, do you have any final questions in your last minute here or so?
Yeah, just the couple of questions, or one main question. We're doing the soil cover and stretch it out. That takes a lot of time. Does it need to be done on every single plot, or should we like do it on half the plots we do in a field? How important is that recording on every single plot? Because it takes an awful lot of time.
Yeah. For me, it's, and I think particularly in cropping, it's probably less valuable because you're going to come in and change it all. I think for that basal density in a pastoral system, I think is really valuable, especially if you've got, and I would, and Abby might growl me, but this is something I might do just to benchmark. And then I might not do it again for another 2 or 3 years, just to look at what's that change over time for your distribution of maybe less desirable species or bare ground or whatever it is that's going on for you. But it is one that does take a lot of time. And this is where it's great to have children on school holidays. Get them out.
Yeah. If we can simplify some of it, that means we can do more of it. And what I have noticed, certainly looking at Charles now, we need to do a lot more photos and just sit till we capture the visual of what we do rather than just record it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm just going to highlight here, Nicole, one of the nice things, Martin, that you have is that because you, at your sample sites, you have each time created a new sample over the years. You can see, for example, in 72 acre here, this is a 2022 recording, 2023, and then 2024. And I did notice that across 72 acre and Woodfield, both of them, it looks like your bare ground is decreasing year on year.
It's certainly, the ground is getting better. It's spongier, it's changing, and having that evidence kind of backs it up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that's a point about some of these things might not seem very valuable until actually you have the trend, and then you can go, oh, okay, actually I can see that does back us up, and photographs are so important. And I think we all think that our memory is brilliant or not, but photos really, obviously we're not relying on memory.
I wish we'd have done this, done some of this baseline in 5 and 10 years ago. We have not took enough records in the past to see where we were then to now, but at least we've got data as we go forward, and that's going to become increasingly valuable to others, that we can evidence the improvements we've delivered.
Yes, beautiful. And I think this storytelling piece is so important for everybody and for producers right now. If you're going to get someone coming in and saying, oh, you can't do that because it kills a newt, and you're like, well, actually I can demonstrate that I got more newts, whatever that is for you. But I think we need to be able to back up what we're doing and stop the greenwashing that's happening too. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Beautiful job.
Thank you. So I was yeah, we can jump to the questions now. There are a lot of questions, so I don't know, and I know Charles, thanks for answering some of them already about specifically to you. But I wonder, Nicole, if there was any that caught your attention first, or that you want me to choose?
Well, I quite like this question of like, there's Anonymous says, people seem to believe after decades of chemically and mechanically managed soil, there can be a turnabout in soil health in a year or two. What time scale would you allow on average? And, that's a piece of string question, but a paper just came out this week showing that fields that have been under organic management for over 20 years, they're still measuring very high levels of residual herbicides and fungicides. And they're wondering if some of that's coming in the rainfall, which is quite possible. But there is no average, but when we're in transition, I really want to be putting high carbon based buffers or something that's going to help mop up some of these chemicals. We had an arable producer that had been growing oats, and at year 6, as he's starting to open up and all those compaction layers, what happened is a whole lot of atrazine was released from that compaction layer, and it killed his oat crop. He actually sent it off to see what had happened and then sourced it as coming through from the soil profile. So, if we don't put carbon in there, then we're not, and when I'm saying carbon, I mean like a compost extract or a fulvic or a humic acid or a biochar or a compost, something like that. That's going to help speed up your transition because it's just going to help protect the plant. And there was another question about pH, and that comes back to the same thing. This is why we asked for that rhizosheath, that you want to see that roots coated with soil, because that's going to defend you against ag chemicals. It's going to defend against heavy metals. It'll buffer that pH by as much as 2 units. So you might be experiencing 5.2 pH, but that rhizosheath will actually help to buffer that anywhere. I mean, it could be up to 7.2, or it could just sit in that sweet spot of 6.5. So it's not biology are moving with the pH, but also that pH is altered with that rhizosheath. So really looking at how do I support plants and defending from that. Abby, is there one that stuck out for you?
Well, yeah, Dan Herdman asked, how would you go about raising protozoa numbers?
So you want to get a test first to see where are you at with protozoa numbers. They are going to be feeding on obviously smaller organisms, microbiology, but they can be very disrupted by things like fungicides, pesticides, compaction. One thing that we like to make is a protozoa tea. You just soak good quality lucerne for 3 days, no more, no less, in water. And then you can actually take that water, dilute it, and I want you to spray it out on your fields. And you'll see if you pump up your protozoa numbers, they're the ones that are cycling nutrients, they're cycling nitrogen, sulfur, all of that, and it'll look like you've applied nitrogen because that's effectively what you've done. So these soils that are really compacted, we'll find very low protozoa numbers in there, and we might actually inoculate with these protozoa teas. So have a play. It's very simple and very quite fun to do.
And well, maybe you could just say the 5 M's again, because a few people have asked for those.
Oh, I typed it in.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Mindset, management, minerals, microbes, or organic matter, or microbes, minerals, mindset. If you're not sure if it's you, it generally is. If you're not sure, ask your wife. Is my mindset the reason my soils are compacted? Oh gosh, only I think I'm funny. That's fine.
Okay, great. So yeah, Richard Davis asked that, Nicole, you mentioned quite a few remedies for reducing compaction and increasing fungal activity in your 2019 book. Is there anything more or less you would recommend now 5 years on?
Yeah, so in the last 5 years, I've been focusing more on training the trainers than working one-on-one. So I don't have ongoing consultancy in the field to really address what would I alter. What I'm seeing though is less is more. And I think some of these things like molybdenum on a seed is probably a new one in my toolkit because of its relationship with ethylene. Yeah, so, but Thanks, Richard. Thanks for reading the book. Yeah, so Rachel asks, how does one know if soil is bacterial or fungal? And Martin, it comes back to your blackgrass issue, and I want someone in the UK to do this work. I want you to do biological testing when you see high blackgrass. I want you to leaf test the blackgrass, and I want you to leaf test the plant that blackgrass is growing with. Are you up for that homework, Martin? Do it. So like, yeah. So what I want to see is there a microbial component? Is there a mineral component that's driving blackgrass? Because I actually think that this could be quite exciting if we can crack it, right? Because there's a reason for why we're seeing blackgrass, not just, obviously time of year, but there's something else going on. And certainly what little I've seen is those soils have all been really, really bacterially dominated. So often your grass weeds are your bacterial dominated indicators. So if you're seeing a lot of grass weeds, I don't know what you got, cooch, yeah, then these might be telling you that something's going on. Oh, wild oat, foxtail barley. Yeah, those kind of things. There's something going on bacterially. Sorry, Charles, did you want to add or ask a question?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think one thing we do know about blackgrass is it's encouraged by wetter conditions, and there's been some work recently which has confirmed that, which has shown that it actually responds to wet, poorly drained conditions by growing even stronger. There's actually a biological process that triggers within it to grow stronger. So for us heavy land farmers, it's invariably a drainage issue if we've got patches of blackgrass that we can't ever deal with. You deal with the drainage, and it usually is it's a pathway, and it just can do better in the wet than anything else.
Well, that again points to bacterial conditions, right, Charles? That we've got bacterial dominance.
I don't know about that bit.
Yeah. So what it means is, so when soils get quite wet and saturated, we're going to lose often our fungal partners, and you end up with a lot of bacteria, and you end up with a lot of bacterial domination. And there's also alcohols and all sorts of things that starts to produce in that soil. So this is why soil structure has got to be one of your number one drivers, and not necessarily thinking about drainage, but how do I build soil structure? And there's things that we know that will undermine soil structure, and in particular is nitrogen fertilizer just collapses structure. So it's like, okay, how do I use, so one product we see used in Australia and New Zealand is a black urea, and it's been around for over 25 years, I'm pretty sure, at least over 20 years. So it's urea that's soaked in humic acid. So you're feeding fungi while you're putting nitrogen on, and what we see is this benefit in soil structure. So I want to see things like that become available in the UK. I feel like you guys don't have access to stuff that overseas people do, which is fascinating. We don't need to get into politics.
They are working on a pelleted form of sewage sludge, which you might not be keen on, which you'll be able to spread on as like you can do a prill through your spreader, which will be an organic nitrogen as opposed to the nitrogen prill. So that's being worked on at the moment.
Yeah. I think it's a shame. In the past and historically in the last couple of 100 years, agriculture has always been the dumping ground for industry. And I feel like this is just another way. Even some of the compost being made in the UK, it's just, you've got a waste problem. We can dump it on farm ground. And it's like, what else is in that? And they're abandoning land here in the US because of contamination from, carbon-based materials, PFOS and PFAS and all sorts of things showing up on farms. So I think we just got to be really, really vigilant, personally.
Okay. I have a few more questions to come, Nicole. Following on from that, Al Fleming says, we once spoke about using cattle dairy slurry on consolidated grassland soils with low phosphate. Would it be better to rip subsoil pre or post?
Rip subsoil. to subsoil or RIP? Is that two questions or?
Not quite clear, but they've made it all one word, RIP subsoil. So I think it's
Yeah.
not.
A subsoiler, and so doing that before or after what? Sorry.
The cattle dairy slurry.
It's a good question, and I think questions like this is where it's a good idea to do some of these trials. I really like being able to set up these subsoilers with liquid delivery so that we can keep those, because if you don't put some kind of carbon food source down, it just seals up again, right? So how can you get something set up so that you could actually be dripping behind as you RIP? A slurry, I think you're going to get probably better incorporation if you do actually spray afterwards, so then it can go down those RIPs, but someone might disagree and go, oh no, I do it before and I get good incorporation. So do some trials with that, but this comes back to what I said to Martin, right? We want to see how do I feed biology with every single pass? I want to be thinking every time, how do I feed my underground livestock? Because they're doing the work. I've got a friend who has the bucket on his tractor, has a 200-liter barrel in the front of it, and he's dripping biologicals. Even if he's cutting for hay, he's dripping stuff down. He's always thinking, how do I feed biology? And so I think you can do that obviously with livestock and herbal lays, but how am I feeding biology?
Great, thanks. And then Martin, there's a few questions for you about specifics. How are you terminating your cover crops? And if that's mechanically, how well is this working? And is the roller on the front of the drill? From Stuart.
A whole different combinations of ways. We've got a crimple bar it built into the drill. It's on the front end of the drill. That's great for terminating brassicary kind of cover crops, but the cereal or volunteers, it doesn't do anything to. We use glyphosate. We graze down to help take biomass out. We have tried grazing and then cultivating instead of using glyphosate. It's taken 2 passes with a cultivator to get enough of the top surface soil movement to terminate all the cover crop plants. Downside of that in the spring, you have to wait for it to dry out to travel, and then it turns really dry. So I haven't got a perfect solution yet, but we are trying to look at different combinations to work out how we can. I don't want to be reliant on a single product of glyphosate, and how do I build a system that sort of moves away from that single purpose treatment.
Great. And Mariella Fleming asks, how do you establish wheat after the legume lay?
We will put winter beans in after the legume fallow because your disease of pest problems within the grasses. We're better off putting the beans in, get the system going, and then come in and do winter wheat or cereals post legumes. I won't put a grass plant, a cereal, straight after a grass legume fallow. Herbal lay, I mean.
Got it. So Richard Davis asks, we've been using multi-species lays for 5 years, but we find chicory and other herbs disappear over 3 years. What can we do to stop this? I think that's for you, Nicole.
Well, I have some ideas, but Martin and Charles, you guys might have some ideas if you want to go first.
No idea.
We let them go to seed sometimes, and that tries to keep the things going.
Yeah. So I guess look at what these different species are. Chicory has 0 tolerance for crown damage. So if you are grazing low, it's gone. It'll go. I've got some dairy farmers I've been working with that have maintained their chicory for over 8 years now. So it's very much around just grazing management. Sometimes we might lose like our legumes, and that could be related to sulfur. So just looking at what is happening minerally in the soil, biologically in the soil. A lot of your herbs like soil slightly more on that fungal balance. So the more bacterial they get, the more grass dominant you're going to get. So I think there's multiple pieces to get excited about in your investigations to take a look at what's going on.
Great. And following up from that, I can see you maybe are already answering this. Debbie Wilkins says, my soil is tight with little air. I think this is caused by very high Ka and Mg. Do you think feeding the biology will help overcome this, or do I need to get air in there first?
It's a good question, Debbie, because what we find is until you kind of address that, then the biology just that high K and magnesium works like a magnet. It's just going to suck those soils really tight. There's a case study in my book where we put down just a small amount, like 25 to 30 pounds or 25 to 30 kilos of gypsum and humate down the drill to just influence underneath the seed. So we're not saying, oh, we're going to address this magnesium across the whole paddock and spend a fortune. It's something that can be very cost effective. And then it just opens it up underneath that seed. So now that plant can get down, it can start building structure, the biology can take off. And we found within 6 weeks, we shifted a soil that was like concrete. Hey, to a soil that's very, very open in 6 weeks, right? The high K, that might be, all right, that's a trickier one to move. And then that might be growing crops that use a lot of potassium. Maybe you grow marijuana? Is that illegal? It is? Okay, so you don't grow marijuana, but you could grow hemp, right? Or corn, things that draw a lot of potassium up out of the ground. It might be something else to look at. Don't grow marijuana. I didn't say that.
Okay, great. So there's a few questions we can answer easily afterwards, so I'm just not asking them now. But there's 2 questions here that are animal related. So Jane Lloyd Francis asks, I'd like to know what you think about moles, please. I guess she's talking about the animal there. And then Anonymous says, does anyone else have problems with badgers digging up hayfields looking for earthworms? So I guess, yeah, thoughts on mammals? No one has any thoughts?
Well, they don't really figure for on-field scale, I would say. Badgers depends very much. I've seen some real messes where they've have their sets close to the edge of fields or even in fields. But digging on a field scale or moles on a field scale generally isn't an issue for us. I don't know about anybody else.
No, we've got plenty of badgers about, but no scratching damage really. The worms are diverse and spread, so they dig a bit, but not a lot. We have a few moles around, but never a massive problem. So yeah, that's not, even on our grass fields, we've had moles, but they don't hang about for too long. They're not causing us massive problems.
Okay, great. So I don't know if Nicole, you have any final comments, or Stephen or Charles or Martin, if you do. But we're kind of coming to time, so I just wanted to give you space to say any final comments, and then we can wrap up. I think Martin's going to give us closing comments officially.
Could I just ask Nicole, if you had a go-to biological amendment that you always would recommend, so like you said, adding biological life, what would be your go-to mix that you would use?
Abby, what would your guess be?
I would say that, well, you would do biopriming of the seeds with, I don't know, yeah, that's my guess.
The elixir of life. What comes out of a worm's butt.
All right.
So I do use a lot of high fungal vermicast when I can get hold of it. So pretty much all of my large scale arable guys, they all have really good worm farms. So using that, because a little goes a very long way, and especially for biopriming, you can save a fortune on some of these other seed dressings. I know it's more expensive at the moment to buy clean seed in your country. But yeah, being able to do that. So that's my go-to. I mean, it is, I was a commercial worm farmer 25 years ago. But I always come back to worms. It's quite funny. I mean, they have all the hormones, the secondary metabolites, bioavailable minerals, microbiology comes out of a worm's butt. So it takes a lot of the guesswork for what do we need to do when the worm's already solved that problem, right? And then if you're up above 60 worms per shovel, which Martin, you're on your head in that way, then you're not going to need to use things like that, right? If you've got the worms.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Well, Martin, you've raised your hand, and so you can ask a question and you can do some closing comments all in one go, please.
Lovely, and thank you very much. I think you've answered it, but I've been wondering about doing compost teas and that dribble down all the time. If is that really worth the investment, and to put those tanks, mixing tanks, on the farm, but also on the kit? Is that worthwhile?
Well, I think when I look at some of the most successful arable farmers I know that have really, high production, very low external inputs, they all have liquid delivery systems. They're all making their own brews. So I personally think it is worth the investment. This is where trials are so good. Can you just jimmy something up to work out what's going to work well for you? Like, you figured out there was something that didn't work. Well, don't waste your time on that. But also, what's your key measurement for success? Because some of these indicators are not instant, right? We're used to seeing the nitrogen instant response. Well, what if that takes 3 years to give you that response, right? And that's where I think using Soilmentor is so valuable, is that you can start tracking that and seeing, oh, actually, that is where we use those biostimulants. We didn't see a change in yield, but now we're seeing water holding capacity. Well, that's worth just as much in yield if you can start holding on to water and not have boggy soils, right? That's a good question.
That's really great, thank you. And thank you very much to Stephen and Charles for sharing your information. I think it's been really valuable, just to the breadth of what's going on, and sort of from early starters to people like Charles really doing lots of stuff. And I think having that evidence base and having a platform where we can collect and share data, and the importance of bringing farmers together to learn and hear from each other, and the importance of tonight and sort of the project that we've been involved with to sort of help farmers have a nose at others and hear from what others are doing. A huge thank you to you, Nicole, for coming along and sort of sharing your wisdom and sort of critiquing what we're up to and sort of giving us confidence that we're heading in the right direction. And also to Abby, to sort of comparing tonight, and Bridget, who brought us all together, who's leading the project we've got going in Bedfordshire. And I look forward to hopefully further events and more opportunities to share data and engage and cheer farmers along of what we can do, because it's by that support, positive support, we can go on a good journey and get to a better place for our farming systems.
Yep, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Yes, thank you. That was really
Everybody.
interesting and very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Abby.
The recording
Bridget.
room.
Victoria.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks everyone for attending as well, and great questions.
Oh, amazing turnout. Appreciate that. Good job. Exciting. All right.
Really, thank you very